Hello, welcome to our presentation on design principles and principles of design as well. In this presentation, I'm going to be mainly talking about two different design principles that we've gone over, but just more generally the importance of having a design principle in mind when we are doing our teaching, when we are developing instruction, and more so once we have already decided upon a goal or a instructional set that we have. It's very important to review that and to constantly reinitiate certain ideas or certain elements of a design model that you already have, and to constantly criticize, but in a very productive way. So first we're going to be going over just kind of what is uh, what is design and what are the principles of design when it comes to instruction. So um, generally speaking, design models in theory have been around for a very long time, but in a more formal industrial kind of framework, they came around the time of obviously the Industrial Revolution, around the early 20th century. Um, there were no specific names for these, but in terms of elements of management, logistics, and other areas for creating frameworks in increasingly complicated systems and industries, the idea that you would have a specific model set up to initiate or to follow through on a plan or anything like that, you can see how this would naturally lend itself to education or business or any element of creating a framework to follow up on. How this changed and how this tended to function as we transitioned later in the 20th century into education and teaching is it was actually born out of implementation into the military. You could see how that could easily transition into education and more just training and instruction, generally speaking. The idea that you could have a framework, either multiple frameworks or the same framework that could be applied in different scenarios or for different purposes, has a very unique interdiscipline quality as opposed to the traditional element or function that a lot of these design models were created for one particular industry, for one particular model of manufacturing. But as they started to gear into more intellectual, for lack of a better term, pursuits of engineering, civics, industrial design, architecture, education, they start to entail more so of a method rather than just a model or something to follow. And the first example I want to talk about, obviously when we get to instructional design, would be the ADDIE model. This is the model that was created within the United States military in around the 50s and 60s, and it saw pretty heavy implementation or adaptation from what it originally had been designed for. And usually this model would just, we're going to introduce an idea, come up with an idea, develop it further, figure out what's the best way to implement it, how can we evaluate if we've implemented that idea well, and then do further analysis. And further analysis usually would end up being, how do we need to change this? Can we keep it? Can we apply it in other scenarios? So you can see how this is basically defined most of the curriculum and or instructional side of what teaching is nowadays. Most of this has been refined, obviously, and as we'll see with the next two more specific examples of this, some apply very well into other areas and other disciplines, as I like to call it. Moving forward would be plug and play, where you can just plug it into a different scenario, a different class, a different teacher, and more or less it will carry over. There are problems with this, as we'll discuss, but then there are also a more eclectic, more refined example in the sense that one has to constantly refine it over and over. Whereas the ADDIE model is very straightforward. It doesn't necessarily lean into either of those areas as much. But in this case, the first example we're going to go over is Understanding by Design Model, or UBD. This was created by Wiggins and McTeague in the late 90s, and this is a very, very common example of what we call backwards design in instructional learning, where we're going to start at the end essentially. We're going to start with what is the goal that we're trying to teach, what is the end game of this lesson or level of instruction. Then we're going to come out with how do we assess this, what are the materials involved in it, and then we will start with the actual planning. So you can think about creating the goal for your lesson, what you're going to do during your lesson, and then the actual lesson plan itself you will create at the end. Very common, and you probably do this if you're a teacher or somebody in education without even realizing it. It's mostly ubiquitous with teaching. This is the general idea. You have a goal, how do you assess the goal, and then you come up with a plan at the end. Rather than doing this in reverse, which is what most people may think is what they're doing, but a lot of time when it comes to instruction and teaching, you're doing the opposite. So more or less, it's very straightforward. This is a good thing and a bad thing, depending upon your idea of what you're trying to teach. And potentially, the more complicated you get and the worse or the less specific your goal is, then this model becomes a problem. It's not so easily plug and playable, as I like to say. The other model that I wanted to discuss, and I think we can keep both of these in mind, this is the kind of cousin to the other model. It's extremely different, but taken together, I think these two models are work very well together. So this is the Dick and Carey model, or DCM, created in the 70s by Walter Dick and Lou Carey. And this is a very experimental, but also adaptable and reviewable model for instruction. And this is more or less pure systems theory. If you're not familiar with systems theory, everything is contained, everything is complete within a system to adapt and change itself. So as we can see, you start with goals, and at every level of this model, you will be revising and reviewing. If your original goals are not sound and they don't line up with anything else in your model or your plan, you just revise it. But as you can see, revising any step along the way will have to or require you to revise everything else. So it is complicated, it is time consuming, or the nicer way to say that would be it's a very iterative model of instruction. But in general, I think the principle here, maybe not so much the actual layout or chapter or way to follow this style of model is not advisable for most people. Like I said, it's not very plug and playable, but the principle here, I think, is very important in design learning. And if you can take the essence of what this model is trying to show, that you need to revise, you need to constantly review what it is you're doing, I think it's very important to keep that in mind, no matter what you are teaching, what your kind of instruction is. This is one of the most seminal things that I think you can take away from any element of instructional design. Thank you.